From the moment the door creaked open, he could feel the weight of the room. It was a mix of cold air and thick silence, the kind that made it hard to breathe. The room wasn't huge, but it felt imposing in a way, like it was built to make you nervous. A grand piano sat in the middle, polished to perfection, its black keys glistening like a row of teeth waiting to be bitten into. The man sitting at the desk barely looked up as he shuffled through papers, his face hidden behind a pair of thick glasses. For a second, the young man standing in the doorway hesitated. He had come so far, yet somehow this moment felt like the biggest hurdle of his life. But he had worked for this. He had been practicing for years, perfecting every note, every movement of his fingers. Today was supposed to be the day it all paid off. He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. He didn't say anything at first. The man at the desk didn't acknowledge his presence either, still absorbed in whatever he was reading. The silence grew, but it wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like you were being judged. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man at the desk looked up. His eyes, sharp and calculating, flickered over the young man's face for a moment before he dropped his gaze to the papers again. "Are you the one here to audition?" His voice was flat, uninviting. It wasn't rude exactly, but it wasn't welcoming either. It felt like a challenge, a test he had already decided the outcome of. The young man nodded. His throat felt tight, but he forced the words out. "Yes, I am." "Right," the man said, glancing at the clock on the wall. "We'll see how this goes. Go ahead. Start whenever you're ready." The young man swallowed and walked slowly toward the piano, the echo of his shoes tapping against the hardwood floor making him feel more exposed. His fingers itched with anticipation, but at the same time they were heavy with nerves. He had performed in front of others before, but this was different. This wasn't just any audition. This was his chance to prove to himself, and to everyone, that he had what it took. He sat at the piano and placed his hands on the keys. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes for just a second, trying to push away the tension coiling in his stomach. He had practiced the piece over and over again. It was a piece he loved, a piece that had always resonated with him. He could feel the familiar rhythm, the gentle rise and fall of the melody. He began playing. The first few notes were steady, confident, and the music flowed smoothly from his fingers. He could feel the sound swirling in the air, wrapping around him, and for a moment he felt like he was lost in it. Everything else, the harsh, unwelcoming room, the man behind the desk, disappeared. It was just him and the music. But then, just as quickly, the rhythm faltered. His mind stumbled, his hands slowed down, and the sound of his fingers against the keys seemed wrong, almost out of place. He wasn't nervous, at least not in the way most people would expect. But this felt different. The man at the desk was watching him now, not with any expression, just a stillness that made the young man feel even more exposed. He continued playing, trying to regain the flow. He hit a few wrong notes, and the familiar anxiety crept back in. What if he wasn't good enough? What if all the years of practice, all the hours spent alone at the piano had amounted to nothing? What if he was wasting his time, chasing something that didn't belong to him? The music stumbled again, and his hands froze on the keys. His heart beat faster, and his palms began to sweat. The silence in the room seemed to grow thicker, like the air itself was pressing down on him. He could feel the man's eyes on him, cold and judgmental, and for a brief moment he considered stopping, walking out of the room, and forgetting the whole thing. But no, he couldn't do that. He had come this far. This was his moment, and no matter how uncomfortable it was, he wasn't going to let it slip away. With a deep breath, he tried again. This time, he focused not on the man sitting behind the desk, not on the mistakes he had made, but on the music itself. He let his fingers move freely, giving in to the melody, trusting his instincts. The notes came together more smoothly now, and the music began to rise again, flowing with the same energy it always had when he played alone. He felt himself slipping into the rhythm, the notes becoming part of his own heartbeat. He couldn't look up at the man at the desk, not yet. The judgment, the weight of his presence was too much. But the music was his safe place. As long as he could play, as long as he could lose himself in the sound, he could push the fear away. A few minutes passed. He had lost track of time. His fingers moved effortlessly, each note bringing him closer to the end of the piece. He was almost there. Just a few more bars and he could breathe. It was coming together. The performance wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was good. It was real. But then just as he reached the final crescendo, something broke. One of the notes slipped out of place, then another, and before he knew it, the music had fallen apart. His hand stuttered on the keys and the sound was jarring like a sudden crash of discord. He felt the cold sweat on his palms again, his breath coming faster. His heart thudded in his chest, and then, before he could recover, a voice cut through the air. "Is that it?" The words were sharp, biting, and it was as if the room had frozen over. The young man's hands hovered over the keys as he looked up, blinking in surprise. The man behind the desk wasn't looking at the sheet music or the piano. He was looking straight at him, his eyes narrow behind his glasses, his lips curled into a sneer. There was no applause, no encouragement, just a harsh, disapproving stare. "That's what you're offering?" The director's voice wasn't loud, but it was cutting. "You call that piano?" The young man's heart sank. The words hung in the air like a weight he couldn't shake off. He had heard harsh critiques before, but this one felt different. It felt like a judgment not just on his performance, but on him as a person. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain, but no words came out. He felt small, invisible, as if the room had become too large for him. The music that had once felt like his safe haven now felt like a burden, something he wasn't sure he could carry anymore. The director didn't wait for him to respond. He just waved his hand dismissively. "You're wasting my time. You need to leave. Maybe you should rethink whether this is the right career for you." The young man's chest tightened. He didn't know what to say.
He didn't know what to do.
His fingers were still on the keys, but now they felt heavy, like they didn't belong to him anymore. He stood up slowly, the cold air pressing against his skin. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the room, the door clicking shut behind him. The silence that followed felt louder than anything. The young man walked out of the building, the weight of the door closing behind him, making him feel even more alone. The harsh words of the director echoed in his mind. "You call that piano?" He could still hear them as if they were playing on a loop, each time digging deeper into his chest. He had hoped, maybe even expected, some form of praise or at least constructive criticism, but what he received was something far worse: dismissal. He had only made it halfway down the stairs when his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from his teacher. How did it go? He stared at the phone for a moment, the screen blurring as his thoughts spiraled. He didn't know how to respond. He could tell his teacher what had happened, how the director had torn him apart, how he felt like he wasn't good enough. But something inside him refused to admit it. He had worked too hard for too long to let one person's opinion define him. With a heavy sigh, he put the phone back in his pocket without replying. He didn't want to talk about it yet. Not until he figured things out. Not until he could breathe again. Instead of going home right away, he found himself walking through the city streets, letting his feet carry him wherever they wanted to go. He didn't think about it at first. He just kept walking, each step feeling more mechanical than the last. The sounds of the city, the distant honking of cars, the chatter of people on the sidewalk, all of it felt like it belonged to someone else. It felt far away, like it wasn't real. He passed by a small park, its green space offering a brief escape from the concrete jungle. He walked into it without really thinking. The park was quiet this time of day, with only a few people sitting on benches, reading or lost in their own thoughts. He found an empty bench and sat down, not sure what he was waiting for. His fingers drummed softly against his legs as he stared straight ahead. The sky was starting to darken and the cool evening air began to settle around him. The sun had dipped behind the buildings and the city lights blinked on, casting a soft glow over everything. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to clear his head, but all he could see was the director's face, his eyes sharp, his mouth twisted into that sneer. "You're wasting my time," he wanted to scream. He wanted to throw something, but instead he just sat there. The anger simmered inside him, mixing with the confusion and the hurt. He had been through so much to get here. Years of practice, hours spent alone with the piano, pushing himself to be better. And for what? To be told he wasn't good enough? To have his dreams crushed by someone who didn't even care to see him for who he was? The worst part was that he didn't know what to do next. He had always believed that if he worked hard enough, if he played well enough, someone would see him. Someone would recognize his potential. But now, sitting there in that park, he wasn't so sure. His hand shook as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone again. He read the message from his teacher one more time. How did it go? He couldn't bring himself to reply. He couldn't even look at the words without feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. He thought about calling his teacher, but he knew that wouldn't help. What was there to say? That he wasn't good enough? That he had failed? That he wasn't cut out for this life? He squeezed his eyes shut and tried to shake the thoughts away. He needed to clear his head, needed to focus on something other than the negativity swirling in his mind. He had always been told that music was his escape, but right now it felt more like a trap. Without thinking, he stood up and walked out of the park, his feet moving quickly, almost as if he were running away from his own thoughts. The city had grown darker now, the streets lit only by the flickering streetlights. He didn't know where he was going, just that he couldn't stay there any longer. After a while, he found himself at a small cafe, its windows fogged up from the warmth inside. He wasn't hungry, but the place felt like a refuge. He walked in, the smell of coffee and pastries filling his senses. He ordered a cup of tea, something warm to distract him from the cold gnawing at his chest. As he sat at the small table by the window, he couldn't stop replaying the audition in his mind. The words of the director, the way he had scowled as if everything Sam had worked for didn't matter. He had always known that there would be challenges, that there would be people who didn't believe in him. But this felt different. This felt like a complete rejection of everything he was. He took a sip of the tea, letting the warmth spread through him. He didn't want to be angry anymore. He didn't want to feel broken. He had been through tough times before, but this was different. He had given everything to music. Every part of himself was tied up in it. He couldn't just walk away from it. It was too much a part of him. But how could he keep going after what had just happened? What was the point of fighting for something when people like the director could so easily dismiss it? The waitress walked by and Sam glanced up at her, then quickly looked away. She didn't notice him. Nobody ever did. The thought stung, but he pushed it down. He couldn't afford to feel sorry for himself. He wasn't the first person to face rejection, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. He had to keep going. He had to prove that he could do this, that he was good enough. But how? How could he prove it? As the evening wore on, he finished his tea and sat there for a long time, lost in his own thoughts. The cafe began to empty, and soon he was the only one left sitting at a table staring at nothing. Eventually, he stood up and left. The cold air outside felt sharper now, biting at his skin, but it was also a reminder that life didn't stop. People kept moving. The world kept turning, whether he was ready or not. As he walked home, he thought about the message from his teacher again. He thought about how for the first time in a long while, he didn't want to talk about what had happened. He didn't want to explain himself or justify his feelings. He just wanted to disappear for a while, but deep down he knew he couldn't. Because as much as he wanted to ignore it, there was still a fire inside him. That fire was the reason he'd come this far. And no matter how many times it got dimmed, no matter how many times people told him he wasn't good enough, that fire would always burn. It was time for him to decide what he would do with it. For the next few days, the young man did everything he could to avoid thinking about the audition. He buried himself in his usual routine, waking up early, going through the motions of practice, eating when he had to, and sleeping when exhaustion took over. But no matter how hard he tried, the words of the director kept coming back to him. "You're wasting my time." Every time he sat at the piano, the weight of those words seemed to hover in the air around him. It wasn't just the rejection that hurt. It was the sense that maybe, just maybe, the director had been right. Maybe he wasn't good enough. But then, one afternoon, as he sat at the piano with his hands resting on the keys, something inside him snapped. He wasn't sure if it was the frustration of not being able to move forward or the sting of the director's words, but suddenly he couldn't take it anymore. He needed to do something different. He needed to prove to himself that he could still do this, that his dreams weren't over just because of one harsh moment. He stood up abruptly, pushing the bench aside. He had always been told to stick with the pieces he knew, the ones he had mastered over the years. But today none of that felt right. He needed a challenge. He needed something that would make him feel alive again, something that would shake him out of this slump. For the first time in a long while, he went to the bookshelf where he kept the old music sheets. There, buried between pages of familiar pieces, was something his teacher had given him a long time ago. It was a piece that no one else had dared to play, a difficult composition full of twists and turns requiring not only technical skill, but also deep emotional control. The piece was beautiful, but haunting. It had always seemed out of reach, something he admired from a distance but never thought he could conquer. But now, staring at the sheet music, it felt like a challenge he couldn't ignore. It was time to face it. He spread the music out across the piano and took a deep breath. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was no longer about impressing someone else. This was about proving to himself that he could push past his own limits. He wasn't going to let one bad experience define him. He started playing slowly, stumbling over the unfamiliar notes. The melody was complex, and at first his fingers hesitated, unsure of where to land. But he didn't stop. He kept going, pushing through the mistakes, letting the music guide him even when it felt impossible. The more he played, the more the music seemed to unlock something deep inside him. It wasn't perfect, but it felt real. It felt like a part of him that had been waiting to break free. Hours passed, and he lost track of time. The outside world didn't exist anymore. All that mattered was the music. Each mistake was a lesson, each challenge an opportunity to grow. He was no longer concerned with what the director had said. The only thing that mattered was the feeling he got when his fingers touched the keys. It was a feeling of freedom, of expression, of purpose. By the time the sun began to set, he had made it through the entire piece, though not without its struggles. His fingers were sore and his mind was tired, but there was a sense of accomplishment that came with pushing through the difficulty. He had done it. Not perfectly, but enough to know that he was capable of more than he had given himself credit for. That night he couldn't sleep. His mind kept replaying the audition. The director's cold, dismissive face was still there, like a shadow in his thoughts. But this time it didn't sting as much. Instead of feeling defeated, he felt a spark of something else. Determination. He had faced something hard, and he had come through it. Maybe he wasn't perfect, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that he wasn't giving up. Not now, not ever. He knew what he had to do next. The next morning he contacted his teacher. He had spent enough time hiding from the truth, and he knew he couldn't move forward until he faced it head-on. He asked for advice, for guidance on how to improve. It wasn't easy to admit that he needed help, but he did it anyway. The teacher replied quickly, offering a few pieces of advice and a challenge to continue working on the difficult piece he had started playing the day before. It wasn't much, but it was enough to reignite the fire inside him. He wasn't just practicing for the sake of practicing anymore. He was practicing to become better, to prove that he had something to offer. He was practicing for himself. Every day after that, he threw himself into his music with a renewed sense of purpose. He worked harder than he ever had before, not worrying about what others thought, not concerned with any auditions or directors. He just played. He allowed himself to make mistakes and learn from them. He accepted that perfection wasn't the goal. Growth was. One afternoon, while playing through a particularly difficult passage of the piece, he hit a note that sent a wave of realization over him. It was one of those rare moments when the music and the player become one. He felt every note, every key, as if it were part of his very being. It was like he could hear the music in a way he never had before, each phrase ringing true in his heart. In that moment, he knew something had shifted. He had made it past the frustration, past the fear of failure. He had found his rhythm again. A week later, he decided it was time. He wasn't going to wait around for someone to tell him he was ready. He knew he was ready. He had put in the work. He had faced the hard moments and pushed through them. It was time to step up again, to show the world, not just the director but everyone, that he could do it. He contacted the director's office and asked for another chance. This time he wasn't asking for validation. He wasn't pleading for approval. He was asking for an opportunity to perform, to show what he could do. When the director's office called back to schedule the audition, it was as if the air in the room changed. There was a new sense of calm within him, a quiet confidence. He wasn't nervous, not in the way he had been before. Instead of worrying about how he would be judged, he focused only on what he needed to do. He was ready to give everything he had. The day of the audition arrived, and he stood outside the building once more. But this time he didn't hesitate. This time he wasn't the same person who had walked out a week ago. He had transformed, Not because of anything anyone else had said, but because he had taken ownership of his own growth. He wasn't just a pianist. He was an artist with something to offer, something worth sharing. When he walked into the audition room, the director was already sitting at his desk, just as he had been the first time. This time, however, he looked up with a curious expression, not the scowl from before. The young man walked confidently to the piano, sat down, and took a deep breath. As his fingers touched the keys, there was no hesitation, no second guessing. There was only the music. This time he played not for approval, but for himself. For the first time in his life, he felt completely free. The young man's fingers glided across the piano keys with a smoothness that felt almost effortless. Each note he played was like a piece of himself coming alive in the music. The room, once cold and judgmental, now felt different. It was just him and the piano. The director, sitting quietly at his desk, watched with a look that was neither approving nor dismissive, just curious. The silence between them wasn't the same this time. It was filled with possibility. As the piece moved along, the young man's confidence grew. The music flowed through him, every note falling into place like a puzzle coming together. He wasn't playing for the director anymore, not for anyone's approval. He wasn't thinking about the mistakes from before, or the harsh words that had followed him for days. He was simply playing, letting the music speak for itself. The piece, once so intimidating, now felt like an old friend. His hands moved fluidly from one passage to the next, no longer struggling with the complexity of the composition. He had spent so many hours working on this piece, hours spent in frustration, in confusion, in moments of doubt. But now, everything felt clear. Every note he played felt right. For the first time, the young man truly understood what it meant to lose himself in the music. There was no fear, no anxiety about what would happen after. There was only the sound, the pure, unfiltered sound of his performance. He glanced up at the director briefly, only to find that the man was still watching him, but there was something different in his eyes. The coldness that had been there before was gone. There was a flicker of something, maybe recognition, maybe surprise, but whatever it was enough to keep the young man focused. He continued playing, pushing himself even harder. The piece reached its climax, the music building to a crescendo, and in that moment everything felt perfect. The young man's hands moved with precision and emotion, the music rising and falling, taking on a life of its own. He felt the energy in his fingers, in his chest, and in his soul. He wasn't just playing the notes anymore. He was telling a story, his story through the music. As the final notes of the piece echoed in the room, he let out a slow breath, his hands coming to rest on the keys. The silence that followed was heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath. He could feel the director's eyes on him, but he didn't look up. He didn't need to. The music had spoken for him. The young man sat still for a moment, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of his breath. The room felt different now, less intimidating, more like a space for creation. He had poured everything into that performance. It had been his best. There was no room for doubt anymore. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the director broke the silence. "Well," the director said, his voice quiet but steady, "that was different." The young man's heart skipped a beat. Different? Was that good? Was that bad? He couldn't tell from the director's tone, but he wasn't about to let fear creep in again. This time he would wait. He would listen. He would trust himself. The director leaned back in his chair, his hands folding in front of him. "It's not what I expected," he continued, his tone still neutral, though there was something thoughtful in his voice. "You didn't play the piece like most people would. Most would follow the structure, stick to the rhythm. But you didn't. You let the music breathe. You let it go where it wanted to go." The young man felt a flicker of hope. He noticed that. The director's eyes met his for the first time, and for a moment there was a quiet understanding between them. "I don't know what I expected from you," he said slowly, "but I didn't expect that. You've got something. I can't deny that." The young man's breath caught in his throat. He had never thought the director would say anything like that. He had always imagined harsh criticism, maybe even rejection. But this was different. This was something more than he had hoped for. The director paused for a moment, as if weighing his next words. "It's not perfect, but perfection isn't the point, is it?" "No," the young man replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not." The director gave a small nod, almost to himself. You've got potential, but you need to stop worrying so much about how others see you. You need to stop playing for approval and start playing for yourself. You've got the skill, you've got the passion, but you have to believe in it, believe in yourself. The words hit him harder than he expected. For so long he had chased after validation, after the approval of others. He had worked to fit into a mold, to meet expectations, to prove that he was good enough. But here was someone telling him that he didn't need to prove anything. He just needed to be himself. "I think you've got what it takes," the director said, his tone softer now. "But you've got a long way to go. This wasn't just a performance. This was you. That's what makes it stand out." The young man nodded, the weight of those words settling in his chest. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being true. "Thank you," he said, his voice stronger now, more confident than it had been in days. The director didn't respond right away. He simply looked at the young man for a long moment, as if considering something. Finally he spoke again, his voice quiet but serious. "I think we can work with that. You'll need to keep pushing yourself. You're not there yet, but I believe you can get there. You just have to keep going. Keep challenging yourself." The young man felt a rush of emotions, relief, pride, but most of all gratitude. This wasn't the outcome he had imagined, but it was the one he needed. It wasn't a perfect performance, but it had been a breakthrough. He had proven something to himself, and perhaps to the director as well. "I will," he said, his voice steady and determined. "I will keep going." The director gave a small smile, the first sign of warmth the young man had seen from him. "Good, then I'll see you at the next one. We'll see where this takes us." As the young man walked out of the room, the weight that had been pressing on his chest for days began to lift. It wasn't gone entirely, but it was lighter now. He had faced his fears. He had proven to himself that he could do it. The road ahead was still uncertain, but it no longer felt impossible. Walking down the hallway and out into the cool air of the city, he felt different, stronger, more alive. The world around him seemed brighter, as if everything was full of possibility. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. He was ready for whatever came next. As he stepped into the streets, he didn't feel like a failure anymore. He didn't feel like someone who had been rejected. He felt like an artist, someone who had something valuable to offer. And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. The weeks following the audition were filled with a new sense of purpose. The young man didn't expect things to change overnight, but a small part of him had shifted. He had learned something invaluable that day in the audition room, something he couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't just about playing the piano anymore. It was about believing in the music, in himself, and in the journey. Each day he woke up with a quiet determination. The piece he had struggled with for so long no longer felt like a mountain to climb. It felt like a road to travel, with plenty of turns and bumps along the way. But he had learned to embrace those imperfections. They were part of the process, and he was learning to love the process. He spent hours each day at the piano, not trying to impress anyone or even to reach perfection. This time it was all about feeling the music, getting lost in it. His fingers no longer hovered in hesitation over the keys. Now they moved with purpose, knowing exactly where they needed to go. But he wasn't always in control. Sometimes the music would surprise him, taking him somewhere unexpected, and that was okay. He had stopped fighting it. The director's words echoed in his mind constantly. "You've got something, but you've got a long way to go," and that was true. He still had much to learn, but it didn't scare him anymore. The road was long, but he was walking it willingly, step by step. There was a quiet joy in the process now, a joy he hadn't known before. One afternoon he decided to revisit the cafe where he had sat in silence days after the audition. The memory of that time seemed far away now, almost like a different life. As he entered, the familiar scent of coffee and pastries hit him, and he noticed that the place was quieter than usual, a perfect setting for reflection. He ordered a simple cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the world outside. The city was bustling, people moving with purpose, their lives unfolding in ways he could never know. But somehow that didn't bother him anymore. He no longer felt the weight of comparison, the need to keep up with others. His path was his own, and for the first time, he was okay with it. As he sipped his tea, he thought about the people who had supported him along the way, his teacher, the few friends who believed in him, and even the director. All of them had played a part in pushing him forward, whether they knew it or not. They had all given him the opportunity to discover what he was truly capable of, to see the potential within himself, and now, it was up to him to keep pushing, to keep learning. He thought back to the many times he had doubted himself, wondering if he would ever be good enough. But those thoughts felt distant now. There was a quiet confidence within him, a growing belief that he was on the right path even if he didn't know where it would lead. Just as he was lost in his thoughts, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his teacher. "How's it going? Are you still working on the piece?" A smile tugged at his lips. He hadn't shared much about his progress recently, but he knew he couldn't hide it forever. He typed out a response. "Yes, I'm working on it every day, and it feels different now. I think I finally get it." He sent the message and waited, feeling the warmth of pride in his chest. It wasn't about the praise or recognition. It was about the realization that he had come so far on his own. He had put in the work. He had faced the doubts, the rejection, the failures, and yet here he was, still standing, still playing. The phone buzzed again, this time with a reply. "Good. That's all that matters. Keep going. You're making progress, even if it doesn't always feel like it." He put the phone down, staring out the window. It was true. He was making progress. Sometimes it was slow. Sometimes it felt like he wasn't moving at all. But the important thing was that he kept moving. He kept showing up. That was the difference. A few days later, an email arrived. It was from the director's office, a follow-up from the audition. The subject line read, "An opportunity." His heart raced as he opened the email. The director was inviting him to another round of auditions. This time, it wasn't a request for just a performance. The director wanted him to be part of a masterclass, to work with other musicians who were at different stages of their careers. It was an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to connect with others who shared the same passion. The young man stared at the screen, his mind racing. This was the chance he had been waiting for, but it wasn't just about the chance. It was about what he had already proven to himself, that he was capable. No matter how it went, no matter the outcome, he had made it this far. He had earned the right to be here. He took a deep breath, a smile spreading across his face. This was it. This was the next step. Over the following weeks, he threw himself into the preparations. The masterclass would be intense, but he didn't shy away from the challenge. He kept practicing, kept learning, kept pushing himself to be better. Every note, every passage was a chance to improve. But more than that, it was a chance to connect, to share the music with others who understood what it meant to live and breathe it. When the day of the masterclass arrived, he stood in front of the large hall, his heart pounding. He was nervous, but it wasn't the same kind of fear he had felt before. This time, it was a mix of excitement and gratitude. He had worked for this. He had earned it. And now, he was ready to take the next step. As he walked into the room, he saw other musicians, each with their own unique style, their own struggles, their own journeys. It was humbling to see how far everyone had come, and it reminded him that he wasn't alone. Everyone in that room had their own battles, their own doubts. But they were there, sharing their music, sharing their stories, and that was all that mattered. He took his place at the piano and looked up at the director, who was sitting at the front, watching quietly. The director's expression was thoughtful, but there was no judgment, no harsh critique. This time the young man didn't need the validation. He didn't need to prove himself. He just needed to play. The music filled the room, and for a brief moment everything else faded away. There was only the sound, only the feeling of the keys under his fingers, the rhythm of the piece, the way it came together. It was the best he had ever played, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. It was him, fully present, fully engaged in the music. As he finished, he took a deep breath, waiting for the feedback. The director stood, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the room was still. Then the director spoke. "That was something," he said, his voice calm but full of respect. "You've come a long way. Keep going." It wasn't the grand praise he had imagined, but it didn't need to be. The respect in the director's words, the acknowledgement of his growth. It was all he needed. He wasn't the same person who had walked into that first audition, full of doubt and fear. He had transformed. He was no longer playing to impress anyone. He was playing for himself, and in that moment that was enough.